Good morning, grasshoppers. I wanted to take a brief moment and just briefly cover chapter 11 and 13 for you this week. These are two volatile subjects that are going on in our contemporary society. Chapter 11 deals with abortion, and it's currently legal to have an abortion. And ironically enough, many of the states, a lot of the southern states, are trying to enact legislation that would make them, if not illegal, almost impossible to obtain. So that is the kind of stuff that's going on. In terms of our chapter, I want you to make sure that you're very familiar with the terms on page 141 and 142. These terms are very important in the sense that if people are going to engage in dialogue about abortion, you ought to know what you're talking about, and you ought to know the relative and specific terms that are utilized in that discussion. So on page 143, when does human life begin? One of the philosophical challenges that we have is you can easily fall into what's called the reductio ad absurdum, and or an infinite regress problem. So if we look at the question, when does human life begin? Um, is it at conception when the sperm and the egg unite and that kind of stuff, or is it prior to that? And you can go back to an infinite regress and just get yourself into some serious heat. I'm not. I'm not sure. And many philosophers adopt this position that it's really necessary to determine when life begins. The medical issue is called viability. So, when is a fetus able to survive on its own? Um, and that is a definitive notion of viability. So, in every state that I'm aware of, abortion at that point is illegal. It would be considered murder. And but what about in the first 8, 12 weeks of pregnancy? Is that murder? Or is that just a termination of the pregnancy? And I think that in some instances it's important to recognize that in terms of the natural world, nature naturally aborts about 80% of all pregnancies in any event. Basic physiology and anatomy and biology will bear that out. Um, so if that's the case, then there's an argument that some philosophers have waged that if that's the case, then is human beings' ability to perform abortions just an extension of the natural order of things? Again, it's just an argument that you might want to consider. Um, The another position here is that the if I can find it here, it's on this page. This side. Um, the the notion of the value of life principle. Um, what is it that, and this is our philosophical question. What is it that makes life value? Of what value is there? Now, I think it's almost a rhetorical question, but it's one that I think philosophers address in the sense that is human life any more valuable than other lower primates' life, for example? And if so, why? That's a very, very important question that philosophers and um, psychologists and folks of that nature that they look at. Um, the which goes to page 145 in the sanctity of life. Um, this is a tough question, because what is it that makes life sanctified? Um, if it's the case, for example, that in another 3 billion years, this is going to be a dead planet, and our sun is going to explode and be dissolved in terms of the universe. How does that fare in terms of the sanctity or sanctification of life itself? Or is life just an accidental phenomena of an evolutionary process? And we all know that life comes in and it goes out, and now what? So again, I just raise those notions for you, that these are questions that come about. Your author raises the notion of the absolute rights of women to have control over their own bodies. And that's a very, very powerful argument. And so as you read through this chapter, um, I just want you to be aware that there are good positions, pro and con, on this issue. And at some point in time, you have to sort that out for yourself. There's no objective rule book out there, so to speak, that says you ought and ought not to do this or whatever. And so, as critical thinkers, you need to sort through that on your own terms, and arrive at the decisions that you're going to make. For myself, as a philosopher, I find the notion of abortion, uh, it's legal, and I think that it is a legitimate mechanism to address particular problems that occur. Um, but at what point does it become immoral to do that? Seems pretty clear to me that if you're going to, if you're going to engage in abortion at 20 weeks, just simply because it's inconvenient, I just find that seriously problematic. And on that note, I mean, I leave the decision up to you. The the other chapter that we have is chapter 13, morality, marriage, and human sexuality. And of course, if you wanted to look at a topic that's absolutely turned right up on its head in our contemporary society, this has got to be the chapter. The historical, conventional modes of marriage and uh, human sexuality have, from the anthropologist perspective or the sociologist perspective, have never been consistent. It's never been uniform in any sense of the term. We look at homosexuality, for example, has probably always been with the human condition. Now, why that is, there are theories and medical responses to that, neurophysiological responses to that question of, why would you have homosexual behavior, tendencies, et cetera, et cetera. And there is an argument that's levied by some thinkers that human beings are actually bisexual creatures, but it's our propensity in culture, that the nature versus nurture dichotomy, that the society so conditions us to be homophobic, or whatever the term is you want to use for that. But if you read Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa, which was one of the first real studies on juvenile human sexuality and development and all that sort of thing, you find a very different perspective going on there. And there are tons of literature out there on, converse positions on, the human sexual appetite, if you will. The So I strongly urge you to check some of that out merely from an awareness perspective. It seems very clear to me that when we look at why do we marry, for example, um, there are lots of folks today who are rebelling against the traditional notions of marriage, and with some good reason. And there's reasons against that. Are you aware of both sides of the issue? And I think that that is the pinnacle issue of a critical thinker, is that when we're looking at why marry, why not marry, we ought to be familiar with both sides of the position. Not merely what mom said, or, some kind of myopic perspective that is totally divorced from out of the realms of our own awareness. The uh, One of the things that strikes us today, sociologists are looking at this, is that a significant number of young people in their 20s and whatever are making a decision not to marry. And they're cohabitating, they're having children, they're raising families, but they're not married in the traditional sense of the uh, term. And what's occurred because of that is a redefinition of what it means to be married. Now we have, in Michigan anyway, it is legal for same sex couples to marry. And 50 years ago, that would have been incomprehensible for that to be a legal situation, but it is today. And does that call into question for us what is the nature of being married? What does that really mean? And is it just an institutional phenomenon? There are certainly legal benefits that you have historically in terms of being legally married. Um, but at the end of the day, has society changed so much that the young people today, and even some elderly folks, they're not getting married. And if you look at the elderly, for example, they don't get married, they cohabitate and don't get married because of Social Security issues and insurance issues and tax issues and things of that nature. So I just want to share with you that when you open up that Pandora's box, you have to be real careful what comes out at you. And so when we look at uh, this particular chapter, all of those questions I think are raised up for us as just sort of general propositional notions. So, the meaning and purposes of human sexuality, historically, human sexuality was viewed specifically for procreation, and anything outside of that was considered blasphemous and, heretical and all of that sort of thing. That's just simply not held to be the case anymore. And that is manifest in so many different dimensions of our culture, in film, in literature, in basic human behavior. So there's uh, those types of issues that are going on in terms of how are we defining what are the legitimate parameters of human sexuality. Um, One of the things I like to share with my students, for example, is, are you real clear in your mind about the parameters of your human sexuality? Um, have you sort of made a list of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's negotiable, what's non-negotiable? And some folks have said, well, that's very silly and all of that. I'm not persuaded by that. I think it's very critical that you, in your own mind, are very clear in your own mind about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and that you're willing to talk about that, communicate with your significant partner. Look, these are my views, these are my attitudes, these are my propensities, etc., etc., and I want you to be very clear about that, and and so that I'm also very clear about what your uh, lists are, if you will. It seems very clear to me that one of the central issues, and you can think about this if you want, it doesn't really matter what your lists contain. They contain anything you want, and I it just seems to me what's important is that you become linked up with someone that your lists are compatible. And so if you're into particular behaviors that may be perceived as aberrant or whatever, you just need to make sure that you're with a partner that those behaviors are appropriate for each other. That whole appropriateness phenomena becomes very, very important. And, you have a 57% divorce rate in this country. I am convinced, from a sociological and anthropological perspective, that one of the reasons for that is because you tangle up and marry folks that are inappropriate, and that causes major, major problems. So don't do that. It's just that simple. Don't do that. Um, so the on page 179, they get into uh, various types of marriage relationships, and I just want to touch on this with you. So monogamy, of course, is two people. The most common type of marriage is the Western world's monogamy, which involves two people, and the traditional and most common form of monogamy is heterosexual. And but that, of course, has changed. One of the things that I wanted to chat about is the notion of polygamy. Uh, Polygamy, in its various forms, of course, is having more than one partner at a time. That you cohabitate with more than one person, and the litany of the forms of that are too numerous to go into here. But uh, one of the things is that if you're so polygamy is the sort of the umbrella term, and then under that you have polygyny, which is having more than one wife at a time, and polyandry, which is having more than one husband at a time. And the notion is that most folks are familiar with the polygynous motif. The Mormons practice that. The American Indians, Native Americans practiced forms of polygyny, and but polyandry is also a practice that is uh, adhered to in what we normally look at as very hostile climates. And so, if you look at some of the more hostile elements, environments in the world, you'll find polyandry as a more common form, simply because the society can't afford too many females. And so that becomes the rationale for that, polyandrous type situation. I just want you to be aware that that goes on. Now we have this notion of group marriage, and uh, it's experimental according to your textbook, but trust me, it's been going on for a really long time, and uh, you know, it's one of those things where we see it in the news or documentaries and whatever, that kind of stuff is going on. The Your author gives pretty good arguments for and against the various forms of marriage that's going on. And so I think that's very important that you are aware of that. On page 183, the big one is adultery. The latest Master Johnson's figures that I'm familiar with were that I think it was 75% of all married men have an affair at some point in their married life. And everybody jumps out the window, evil men, that kind of stuff. But the contrary figure is that 57% of women, of married women, engage in extramarital affairs. What that raises for us is, what is this big draw to adultery? What's the psychological drive to it? What is the philosophical legitimacy for that in terms of your moral standards? Um, and people spend their whole career studying just that figure. And, it's one that's incredibly complex, and it's uh, manifests more than we would like. And you're, as an individual person, critical thinker, you need to have that sorted out in your head. What are the legitimate parameters that would legitimize an adulterous situation for you? And on what grounds would it be absolutely unacceptable? Things of that nature. So you're looking at both sides of the question. Um, the On page 185, uh, the notion of pornography is risen, and the last time, or what I'm aware of, for example, is that pornography pretty much is free, I guess, online, and there used to be pornographic bookstores, and I don't know if they exist anymore. I just don't know, but um, you know, why would they uh, why would they exist? So, in any event, I think that these chapters are very good for us. I think that in terms of ethics, they're very important, and so I want you to take your time and go through that. I think you're doing very, very good work, and I'm very pleased with what I'm seeing. And we are quickly approaching the last week of our class. So keep up the good work. If you have any questions, drop me a line.